So I'm Andy Griffiths, I'm Head of Sustainable Procurement for Diageo. So my team is responsible for our total footprint beyond operations, so both upstream and downstream. So in terms of on-trade, off-trade, upstream, not just from a raw materials and agricultural perspective, but in terms of all of our procured interests. So a very diverse team, grown rapidly. So the last 12 months, the team's grown from 3 to over 30 now. So again, evidence in the level of focus that we're putting on this to really drive that transition and making sure that we've got the right resource there to support our suppliers and our partners to drive that change. So what I'm going to do today, we've got, from what we call our Spirit of Progress commitments, 3 primary areas. One focused on positive drinking, one focused on inclusion and diversity, and then the third one, which is the one I want to talk about today, focused very much on grain to glass sustainability. And this really looks at 3 key elements. One is focused very much on water, preservation of water. Again, we have differing levels of dependence and risk in different countries, so really important to us. Accelerating to a low carbon world, which clearly aligns with the net zero discussion today, and then becoming sustainable by design, which sits across both of those. So really looking at how we redefine our products, our business models to ensure that we're embedding change right from the outset. So when we look at Diageo's footprint, it's very similar to most agri-food businesses. So typically you'll tend to find most agri-food businesses, at least from a branded perspective, will have between 10 to 20% of their footprint in what we call scope 1 and 2, so primarily the operational side of the business. And then 80 to 90% of their footprint will typically sit in their what's called scope 3, so beyond operations, with the majority of it sitting upstream. And for us, you can see roughly a third of that footprint comes from agriculture and raw materials. So really important to us that we understand that and really understand how we work with our suppliers, with other partners to drive the change to help address that in terms of our overall footprint. Again, we hear a lot about agri-food systems and the impact that agriculture has on the environment. We recognise that that's the case and there are ways of adapting practices, but we take a very clear view that we want to work with farmers to help enable that change. We're not going to come and tell you what to do. You guys, farmers, agronomists, are best placed to do that. It's really about how we can help activate and support the transition and ensure it's a viable and sustainable transition. And this really plays through in terms of the reason for driving change. So many companies may well be looking at driving change because they've made external commitments, because of pressure from civil society. But for us, it really is about risk management. So if you look on the right-hand side, these are charts which are pulled together by the World Economic Forum, and they go out and poll a whole range of different organisations, businesses, governments, civil society, to understand what the primary drivers of risk are to global economic growth. And you can see in the early days when they used to do it kind of 10 plus years ago, the bulk of the challenges were very much around economic or geopolitical concerns. But what you can see very clearly is in the last 2 or 3 years, the primary focus has been around environmental concerns and the risk that that poses to the global economy and the risk it poses to businesses who are operating in that space. So from our perspective, it's really important that we drive an effective transition, for the benefit of ourselves as a business and for the benefit of society more broadly, and clearly our broader supply chain as part of that. And again, this might be a bit too small to see, but you'll be able to see it in the deck afterwards. We've been going through, for all of our agricultural commodities, and mapping through the risk on a region-by-region basis. So we've got real clarity as to what that looks like, what that means for us as a business, and therefore where we need to prioritise engagement to drive change. But this just shows, from my perspective, that this is really important to us. And again, it's important we find the right ways to engage with our suppliers to drive that transition. So how are we approaching it? I guess the first point is clearly we're focused on regeneration, but not just of farms. but of farmed landscapes. So this is really looking at how we work with our suppliers, with our farmers, but also how we look at working with the broader communities in those locations and drive more effective commercial flows through those communities and farmer networks. Second one is that, like I said, we're not going to be knocking on people's doors telling them what we think they should be doing. For us, this is about empowering our farmers, our suppliers, to enable that change. So really looking at how we make sure we're putting yourselves at the centre of decision making in terms of enabling that transition. Again, really looking at how we leverage that through our brands. So again, you could argue that's for commercial benefit, but actually, with the power of some of our brands, there's a real opportunity to leverage more effective engagement and help consumers understand the importance of farming and agriculture within the overall landscape that we're considering. Again, driving not just environmental but social benefits, so really looking at an integrated approach. So this isn't about focusing on carbon here or water here, this is about looking at how we think about this in its entirety. And if we do that, it's much more efficient, but it also provides much greater clarity when yourselves are building your business plans and really looking at how you can optimise and diversify income. And then finally, we recognise a lot of this is new space. So there are a number of practices, a number of activities that have been researched and assessed, but there's still a lot of space where that isn't the case. So again, we recognise that we're not going to sit on our hands and wait. This is about how we help enable change, and then working with our suppliers, working with academic institutions, working with technical advisors, look at how we best assess that and leverage those insights to drive change and pace at the same time. And as part of that, it's a progressive growth programme. So again, for us and for other businesses, this is about stepping in. We're keen to lean in early and significantly and scale rapidly, but also recognising for a number of our partners, particularly farmers, there may be concerns, there may be a level of hesitancy. So again, enabling each of our partners, each of our farmers to step in at a pace that best suits them to enable that transition to take place, hopefully as swiftly as possible, but in a really sustainable way. And I touched on this earlier. Like I said, you may see a number of organisations leaning in to region ag and agricultural transformation, very much on the basis of carbon-based outcomes and impact on climate. But again, as I mentioned earlier, for us, it's important we consider the range of different potential outcomes that could be enabled through driving some of these practice changes. And if we do that, the benefit is all of those opportunities, or many of them, can be monetised. So again, providing opportunity for income growth, income diversification, which is important if we're going to drive a real sustainable change. So we've been locking that into our thinking. To the early point, I've been with Diageo 12 months. So about 12 months ago, we kicked off the Guinness programme. I'm actually with our growers the next 2 days, which is unfortunately why I need to shoot off after this one. Really focus on how we can start to drive that transition across our agricultural supply, particularly our barley supply for Guinness. And that's great, that's moving positively. But what we really want to do is understand how we can move with pace and with scale, but in a way which is sensitive to our suppliers and farmers. So how are we going to do that? Well, one of the other things I've been doing, in addition to my role at Diageo, is for the last 5 or 6 years working with some other partners, co-developing what's called the Landscape Enterprise Networks model. So it's an independent model which really helps drive transformation of landscapes of agriculture through driving multi-sector investment into that transition. So all I'm doing now is just spend a few minutes going through a quick overview of what Lens is, how it works, what the key principles are, and potentially what this means for us collectively in terms of driving a change. So the first thing is that Lens is structured very much on environmental commerce. So this isn't about potentially loading landscapes up with unserviceable debt. This is about looking at how we can encourage and enable increased flow of funds and commerce within the landscapes, the farm landscapes, not just in the UK, although that's where we originally started, but on a global level. And that's really important. Like I said, that drives income diversification, drives income growth, drives a real shift in terms of building resilient communities and resilient farm models. So how's it structured? Again, similar to the points I made from a Diageo perspective, it's looking at a range of integrated outcomes. So it's not just focused on carbon, it's focused on the outcomes that are relevant to the organisations who have a dependency in that landscape. And that's crucial because rather than looking at farmers as being purely producers of agricultural crops, there is a real opportunity for us to consider how you can monetize some of the other benefits or ecosystem services that you can deliver. And when you start thinking that way, many businesses particularly, as well as understanding the language of pound, shilling and pence, understand the language of risk. So rather than talking about impact, if we start to talk to businesses about dependency, they understand that. And it's much easier then to help them understand why they should be investing into those local landscapes, into the farmers, the land managers within those landscapes. The other benefit is it brings you back to the same point. So you can see here, you may have different sectors, whether it's retail, whether it's housing, linear infrastructure, as well as brands like ours or organisations, branded organisations like ours, who will have a dependency on a particular landscape. That might be around agricultural supply, it might be around flood risk, it might be around access to talent and retention of talent, a whole range of different dependencies. But ultimately, those dependencies will flow back to the same natural assets, many of which you guys will be managing within your farm models. So once we start to build that understanding, you then start to build a real recognition that actually, if those different organisations were to co-invest to deliver the dependencies or manage the dependencies that they have on the landscape, that means we can potentially monetize that and drive funds back into those individuals who are managing those ecosystem services, those outcomes from the landscape. And that's really important because what that means then is, rather than being dependent purely on organisations like ours, we can crowd in a whole range of other sectors to help co-fund that transition. So as an example, if you look at hedgerow, many of us maybe just consider it as field boundary. Some organisations considering it as an opportunity for carbon sequestration. And interestingly, through Lens, just going back to that academic piece, when we constructed the Resilient Dairy Landscapes programme in southwest Scotland, as a result of that work, we were able to evidence that hedgerow actually stores twice as much carbon as was previously thought. So again, building that evidence base through that approach. But the really important piece is, when you look at the hedgerow, if you get the right hedgerow in the right place, not only can it potentially deliver carbon sequestration, but it can deliver a range of different outcomes, whether it's water related, whether it's around natural habitat and biodiversity, access for recreation if they're planted on a riverine basis, for example, recognise health benefits in terms of access to water, or, again, right hedgerow, potentially even feedstock for other businesses as well. So suddenly a range of different outcomes that could be monetised. So Lens has been structured, like I said, as an independent proposition. We're actually incorporating it as an independent entity in the next couple of months. It's a not-for-profit. So again, the focus is about enabling change rather than trying to make money out of driving change. It's very straightforward. So it's quite complex under the hood in terms of the mechanisms that underpin it, but the core principles in terms of both farmer, land manager, community engagement on the one side, and in terms of business and government engagement on the other, is to keep it simple, keep it straightforward. And again, going back to the dairy piece, done a lot of research and assessment with dairy farmers around that work to understand what are the key drivers, what really are they looking for a transactional model that would work for them. And the key elements of Lens that underpin that, firstly, is it's demand-led. So this isn't about saying we've got an environmental problem, how do we resolve it? It's about saying let's look at a particular landscape, then let's look at which organisations have a dependency on it, and then let's start to structure the proposition around that demand-side interest. And that drives much greater clarity in terms of what the ask is and much greater clarity around what kind of funds can be enabled to flow through that programme. It's multifunctional, like we said, not just about carbon. It could be a range of different outcomes, again, driven by the requirements of those dependent organisations. It's collaborative. This isn't about Diageo or another organisation coming in and doing their thing their way. This is about trying to group together large and small dependent organisations to collaborate, co-fund and enable that transition. But also it's collaborative across the programme. So again, very much focused on how we work with farmers, land managers, advisors to drive the right outcomes and putting the decision making absolutely in their hands. It's business-like. One of the key pieces of feedback we had is this is transactional. You tell us what you want, tell us what we need to do to achieve it, not in terms of practices, but what outcomes need to be seen. You tell us what you're prepared to pay, and if we do it, then we get paid. Very straightforward, and we've seen farmers engage quite quickly on that basis. Very minimal red tape associated with the programme. Organic growth, we don't try and boil the ocean. We start small. We look at a handful of players initially, so typically 3 or 4 dependent organisations. Once we've got an established programme, we then grow and scale, bringing in a range of other dependent organisations. And it's absolutely, by definition, place-based. So it's looking at particular locations and looking at how we build the programmes around those locations and the communities who are based there. In terms of how it operates, again, I'm not going to go into the detail, but in principle, it's an aggregating-based model. So you would have a regional lens entity, a special purpose vehicle that we would set up with engagement and involvement from key local stakeholders. We would then kick off a process where we engage with those key demand-based organisations, understanding what those needs are, understanding what they're prepared to pay to deliver those outcomes. And then the special purpose vehicle engages with what we call supply aggregators. So they may be suppliers. Many of the supply aggregators are suppliers. It might be a local NGO. It might be an advisory body as well. And they would work with that special purpose vehicle and with the farmers to basically construct those different propositions. So basically breaking them up into key farmer groups or farmer and land management groups. They would build their proposition, identifying what outcomes they could deliver, identifying what funding they would need to deliver that, and then that's consolidated by that SPV, and then we structure the trade. And then basically as those outcomes are delivered, then the funds flow through via the supply aggregator to the farmers and land managers. So very straightforward in terms of how that's structured. The other key element we've been able to do is to show how not only can we leverage business interests in terms of funding, but also because we're enabling commercial flows within those landscapes, suddenly you start to see the investors and the insurers pricking their ears up because they can see the opportunity to scale and leverage those commercial flows. But also what we've been able to do is evidence how, and we work with a number of organisations, the likes of National Trust, Green Alliance, First Milk and others to kind of test and pilot this, how you can manage a blended finance solution. So not just drawing through the business interests, but drawing through public interest investment as well. So local government and national government. So many of our programmes now are starting to build, with a couple of them already having local government funding flowing through them. Again, the reason for those interests is because it's a stacked investment proposition. So going back to that hedgerow example, one intervention delivering multiple outcomes, it's both really efficient and drives income diversification for the farmer, but for the funders, it's also a very efficient mechanism for funding as well. So that's why there's a real interest to drive that scale, drive that opportunity. Again, I won't spend much time on this, but again, we've got a number of partners across different spaces engaging for different reasons. From a farmer and land management perspective, typically the feedback we're getting is very much around helping to build farm resiliency and community resiliency. Shared agency, we're not telling you what to do, we're telling you what we need, and then working with yourselves and other technical advisors to determine what's right to deliver that. And very much about building support and capability. So how we work with yourselves to grow that competence within those landscapes. So lens, like I said, we've not made a lot of noise about it, but it's been growing, evolving over the last 5 years. A range of programmes across the UK where we originally started. This slide's quite old now. We've got obviously the South West Scotland programme. We've got 2 new programmes that are in very early stage of development, which is why today's quite useful. One around Leven and Fife, and then one around Speyside. And then some others across Wales and in Ireland as well now. But also established programmes in mainland Europe, across Poland, Italy, Hungary, a couple of new programmes being developed in a couple of other locations, and now starting to extend into the likes of Indonesia, Americas and Africa as well. So an independent proposition, but really focused on how we can enable that rapid scaling and commercial flow. And the key thing is, being a not-for-profit, the whole proposition of Lens is it's open, it's transparent, it's evolving. So we're not saying best thing since sliced bread, we can do anything, everything. This is about progressive development and working with our partners to build and evolve that programme, that model together. So really looking at how we can work with not just our academic partners, but with our supply partners as well, to build that evidence base, refine that evidence base, test it in different locations. We know different crops, geographies have different challenges. To build partnerships to enable that to happen. Continue to evolve more and more effective financing models, again, which deliver efficiencies for the funders, but importantly drive that income growth, that income diversification for our upstream supply. And then also looking at technology tools about how we can make it as easy as possible for all the partners across the programmes to engage and to drive effective decision making. So that's me. A quick roll through, like I said, hopefully to give time for questions. So hopefully that was useful, and yeah, open up to the floor.
Okay, can I just ask if you want to put in a question, just put your hand up and one of the staff will come round with a microphone just so everyone can hear. Anyone got a question?
Thanks, Andy. That was interesting. Question, you've chosen a rather divisive term, regenerative, which is kind of splitting people a lot these days.
Yeah.
Are you going to set a definition to that, or it's a very loosely defined term already, and are you going to solve that problem?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. So if I step back a little bit, I had a lot of discussion around this. I was involved in authoring a paper for the UN around transformation of food systems, and we had exactly the same discussion. Yeah, what is it? What's it called? How do you define it? Should you define it? I think the key thing from my perspective is we need something to help gather people around. I think otherwise it is too disparate a proposition to really kind of drive traction. But personally, I'm on the one hand, we do need a level of definition to ensure that key stakeholders externally understand it, understand that it is a positive proposition, and understand the rationale for driving that proposition. But on the other hand, for me, I'm also very keen that we keep it flexible. Yeah, we're leaning into space where it is all about test and learn. And I think, again, the risk for me isn't so much the term of regenerative agriculture. I think it's more about how it's being applied or pushed. And I think for me, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, at Diageo, we're not coming in telling people you're going to do regen ag, this is the way you're going to do it, these are the top 3 interventions, you apply those, you tick the box, we'll pay you, if you don't, we don't. Yeah, this for me is about every crop geography is different. Therefore, we need the farmers, the land managers, the agronomists who know those locations, know their own business models, to be at the centre of that decision making. So we need to help make sure that the right partners are coming together and that we're looking at the right kind of practice change to enable the outcomes we all need to see. But that we need that flexibility, we need that kind of farmer, land manager, community centricity to drive an effective transition. Otherwise, we'll get the wrong decisions, the wrong outcomes for everyone.
Thank you. Amy?
Thank you. We all know that all our farms are different. So my question is, what will you base your parameters on to judge the results? Is this going to be done on a very local basis, as you were saying, because my farm is in one area, it's different to another farm that's in Morayshire, for example. The soils are all different, the cropping is all different. It's something I find very interesting about this drive towards sustainability. How are you going to measure that and set a baseline? Do you think there'll be enough focus at a local level? Because it can't be done, I don't think, nationally.
No, and again, that's a really good point. I think, for me, again, it comes back down to kind of how we define the proposition. And I think there is a risk from an approach perspective that we try and simplify, and then by simplifying, we get the wrong outcomes. And to your point, every crop, every geography is different, every farm's different. We need to make sure we've got the right approaches, the right tools and mechanisms to underpin that. And what that means is, for organisations like us, we need to lean in to help develop or support the development of those tools and methodologies. So there's a process called MRV, or a principle called MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification, which is used for primarily carbon, but again we're looking at how you apply that across all outcomes. And what we need to do is find mechanisms which are easy. We don't want them to be overly burdensome for farmers, but are representative, and that we can also refine over time as well. And we know that looks different for different outcomes. So some things are more advanced, for example, on carbon than maybe they are on habitat and biodiversity. So what we've been doing is we've been actively identifying and working with key technology partners, key technical advisors, and bringing farmer voice into that to understand what are the right kind of propositions and how do we develop those solutions to make them work. So if I give you an example in terms of soil carbon, where there's clearly a lot of discussion about, how significant is the opportunity, how do you measure it, how do you potentially monetize it as a farmer. From my perspective, particularly with carbon, it needs to follow the crop. But if you want to get the right kind of funding, we need to open up, like we said, to other funders. So if we're going to do that, then what we need to do is find the right ways of enabling that detailed measurement. So we've been working with one organisation who can now do really granular soil samples, so across three horizons, for about a fifth of the cost of typical soil sampling. So it's much, much cheaper now than through traditional soil sampling and assessment. But we've not just stopped there. We've plumbed them into some of our other partners who are very focused on near-Earth observation and satellite monitoring. So again, the satellite monitoring models are quite interesting, but they are just models. So what we've done is say, well, if you have that satellite monitoring, that near-Earth observation, you can get a reasonable level of granularity from a modelled perspective. If you can then use the likes of agricarbon to do in-field assessment to ground truth that model, then you can start to refine that model so it becomes progressively more and more accurate, which means that A, it's much cheaper for all concerned, B, there's less disturbance for farmers because you're not having to do as much sampling going forwards, but we have real confidence in the data that's being managed as a result. So for us, that's building real confidence, and with the stakeholder we're engaging with, they're saying that this provides much greater accuracy, much greater confidence in the kind of numbers than we're seeing anywhere else. So that's the kind of approach. So we're doing the same in terms of water. We're looking at how we do the same from a habitat and nature perspective. That's much more difficult. And again, it'll be different tools. So it may be, and again, appreciate there are challenges on this from a farm perspective, but is there a role, for example, with citizen science to help underpin some of the nature and habitat-based outcomes? But again, we need to develop all those with the right academic partners, the right technology partners, but we absolutely need you guys in the room to ensure that those kind of developments are appropriate for yourselves. It's pointless working something up which doesn't work for you guys in terms of application. That's very much the approach. So it means we've got to lean in hard to drive those changes. But for me, that's incumbent on us to do so if we're going to drive the kind of changes we want to see.
Hi, thanks, Andy. Very interesting to hear you, and we all know this is the way it's going. But I wonder if you could ask me a question. As a cereal grower, supplying a lot of grain to yourselves, should we be very careful at selling our carbon capture? Because I've had guys coming to me, offering me bigger gross margins for a 25-year term, basically to sow down grass and maintain it and run it for a better gross margin than I can grow cereals for you. So how do we still grow cereals to you and be as well off? That's the thing I would like to know. So in other words, the value of the carbon capture is maybe worth more than the crop, and that's my issue. I want to grow grain, but
no, and that's really important, and I think there are a few things. So one is, in terms of the carbon market, it's still a very immature market in terms of nature-based carbon. Exactly, it's there, but it's immature, and there are risks associated with markets. So again, I won't go into detail, but there is a risk in terms of where that goes, how that evolves. For me, what I want to see is a sustainable and secure income for yourselves, and being able to manage that. And the way to do that, one route is for people like us to pay it as a premium on the crop, which will give some headroom. But in reality, the better route for me is to look at that kind of lens model where we're taking a payment for ecosystem services type approach. Now, the benefit of that is it means you get paid not just for the carbon, but you get paid for all those other outcomes as well. And we have a range of other partners prepared to pay for them. So if you look, for example, at the East of England programme, we've got water utilities in there, we've got local authorities in there, we've got obviously big FMCG in there. From an ag-food perspective, all funding in to the farmers, and what they've seen now is the overall level of funding flowing in is greater than the funding they could extract purely from selling the carbon on the market. So it drives a much more sustainable model with a greater income opportunity than just selling the carbon from those fields. And you still sell the crop, so you've got the crop and all of those other outcomes that you can trade on.
Yeah, it's the value of the carbon in the land, because basically the land is the asset which we have. So I'm concerned that we give it away to our marketeers who are going to sell it on at a higher value than we're going to receive, and that's my point.
Exactly, and that's why with the Lens programme it addresses that. So this is about setting the trades up directly between yourselves with your supplier, creator, your supplier. So that may be Scottish Agronomy, for example, in this instance, and then basically trading that back direct to the funders. So there's no other middlemen. So it plays through. You've got real clarity, real simplicity, and you've got the ability to leverage not just payment for carbon, but payment for those other outcomes as well.
Jimmy Smith, Andy. I'm not a farmer, I'm actually an investment manager, so I see much more of this every day on ESG, which seems to be got a full tidal wave behind it. My definition of sustainability is profit.
Yeah.
You did mention that a couple of times. A couple of quick questions then, and they're all just short answers. I'd like to hear what your definition of an unsustainable thing actually is. Everybody talks about sustainable, but nobody tells you what is unsustainable. So maybe if you give an example of what you think an unsustainable farm system is. Secondly, in terms of sustainability, will Diageo then cease using French maize to make Scottish whisky? And secondly, you kind of try and put Diageo, if though it's involved in food. I think we know that Diageo does alcohol, which not very many folk would say would be food. So if you were really wanting to go the way to save the world and have food, then you would stop actually making whiskey. And lastly, when you said that I do have some hedges. When you said I could make money out of having hedges, I wonder if you can tell me how I do that, because as far as I'm concerned, they're just a cost.
That's fine. So I'll quickly rattle through those. So in terms of sustainable versus unsustainable, in terms of unsustainable, it's basically systems where they will not be able to be perpetuated going forwards. And that might be from an environmental perspective, it might be from a social perspective, or it may just be from an economic perspective. If we can't make sure that we're delivering positively against those three, and that's true for anyone, then the system is ultimately unsustainable. So that for me is really straightforward. So it's not just about the environmental piece, it is about all of those three core elements. I think in terms of transition, clearly our focus is to source as far as possible from the localities within which we're producing, and we continue to do that. There are occasions where we do have to draw in materials from elsewhere. That's the commercial reality, but our primary focus is on sourcing local to production, and we not just UK, we're doing that in Africa, we're doing that in Latin America, we're doing that in India. So it is really about trying to drive local supply, local flow. In terms of, I talk about, not from a Diageo perspective, that's from a personal perspective, I talk about agri-food, because I think we need to talk about agri-food as one combined proposition initially, because that's how we need to think and we need to act. Because if we do so, we can bring together a whole range of different interests to fund and enable the change. If we look at this on a discrete actor-by-actor basis, then we're just going to pull farmers in a whole range of different directions and just not make traction. So it is important that we think about ourselves, not as Diageo, but all players across food and bev and agriculture as part of those agri-food systems. So that's crucial. And in terms of business models, we've all got different business models. We're here to manage those, and at the end of the day, if we weren't here servicing that interest, then I'm sure there'd be someone else here. So I'd rather it be us driving an effective change and putting in place the right kind of systemic changes that will underpin a positive agri-food system in the future.
And hedges, how do you make money?
Hedges. Let's pick up offline on that one, Jimmy. So we've got some examples in South West Scotland already. So happy to discuss that.
Okay.
Here we go. Point. So this all sounds very good, but are you going to kick off by trying to use local stuff as much as you can? Because we hear these sounds, but we still see the boats coming into Montrose, which is fine if you can't source it here. But high nitrogen barley we can grow. We have grown. We grow it very well, but we still see this imports. Now, business is business, and it's human nature to buy well. I have no problem with that, but if we're going to do all these things, whoever you're buying from has to do the same.
Yeah, and I think that's key. So if you look at how we operate, we recognise that if we're going to support and enable the kind of changes we need to see, then we need to rethink how we manage some of those solutions. And like I said, we need to operate within the commercial realities that are out there. But our primary focus is on local supply, and like I said, not just for Scotland, but across all of our key production markets. So yeah, we've got to look at that. We've got to understand that, because and this is true of any organisation in this space, we need to reach back to the farmers. We can't deliver this change purely through engaging with traders, for example. We've got to reach back through and find effective ways of reaching back through to the farmers. And again, that's why Lens is quite a valuable proposition, because it does enable us to reach back to the farmers, the land managers, to help support and underpin that change.
Somebody has a question up here?
I've got one here. My question is actually a lot simpler. Who's paying and why? By that I mean, if we're selling carbon sequestration so that people can continue adding carbon to the atmosphere, we're not actually going to achieve anything from their current position.
No. So two things. I'll answer that in two parts. So in terms of who's paying, we've got a range of different interests with different outcomes that they're funding. So, for example, the water utility companies are very much focused on water quality, water availability. We've got local authorities primarily funding around flood risk, but also around local economic growth. We've got linear infrastructure, primarily looking at biodiversity net gain, similarly for housing, where that's a key requirement in those locations. So you've got a range of different outcomes. So this isn't just about carbon. So that's the first thing. And you know, funding well to deliver those outcomes. On carbon, across any organisation, you know, we should be looking at reductions in the first instance. So really driving reduction efficiency. And then ultimately, you know, if you get to a point where there is something incompressible part of your footprint, then okay, offsetting might be part of that. From my perspective, operating across that kind of agri-food systems space, you know, we've got the ability to work with farmers, land managers to help reduce the carbon footprint of those agricultural supplies. And that, for me, is the key element that we can leverage through models like Lens. And that, for me, it goes back to the point of selling carbon. I've seen elsewhere farmers who've been encouraged to sell their carbon and effectively separate it from the crop. Once you do that, maybe not today, but at some point, that will start to challenge the value of the crop, because arguably the carbon should flow with the crop. But it's important, if it does flow with the crop, that we make sure that farmers are appropriately recompensed. But the way of doing that, like I said, it is not necessarily paying a premium on the crop, but taking that payment for ecosystem services approach where you can monetize a range of outcomes that you guys can deliver, not just the carbon-based outcome. So that's where my head's at.
The plan today is would be to have a panel question and answer session at the end of the day, but unfortunately Andy can't be with us. So we've got time for a few more questions specifically for Andy. There's one up here.
Ken Durson from Forfar. I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, you've raised your staff from 3 to 30 in a year. Now, conservative business prices, that's from 100,000 to £1 million. That's cost you this last year, which is considerably more than I earn in a year. This has obviously had to be passed on in your end product. And the second point is, we can shortly be able to buy a nitrogenous fertilizer made with hydrogen. But the only snag is it's going to cost, I think it's 20 or 25% more. Are you going to pay us, and that will reduce our carbon footprint for grain production roughly from 50% down to 25%. Are you going to shaft us again as you've done in the past? And you'll just pay us a token to get us started, and then you'll reduce your premium all the way through. If you want us to do these sort of things, you have to pay for the commodity that we give you. And so far, you've kept reducing it literally year after year, apart from when there's been a shortage.
So,
thank you.
No problem. So to answer those two questions, let me start with Timon, and it plays through actually across both questions. So there's an assumption that the application of sustainable thinking, sustainable practices drives on cost, and that's not the case. The reality is, if we apply the right thinking in the right way, we can actually take cost out of the system. So I've done that previously prior to joining Diageo, took substantive cost out of the system by rethinking how we do things, particularly in terms of resource use, resource efficiency. So that drives significant opportunity. So increasing my team size enables us to focus, and this, like I said, the team isn't just looking at raw materials, it's looking across all of our supply interests, across packaging, across energy, across marketing, indirects, all of our particular interests. So that enables us to rethink how we do this and drive efficiencies through that approach, whilst also ensuring we continue to accelerate reduction of our footprint. So that's really important. The second point, in terms of how we support farmers, is we could do that. We could just say, well, let's pay for that particular fertiliser option. But what we've been doing is working with other partners to look at how we can develop new options. So we're currently working on the development of an alternative fertiliser option which has a 90% lower footprint than current chemical fertilisers, but is actually cheaper than current chemical fertilisers. So it would actually be cheaper for you guys to use on farm with a significantly lower footprint. So again, they're the kind of opportunities where, again, we need to lean in, we need to help take action to support the development of these new opportunities, which will help underpin the work that you guys might want to undertake. So for me, that's really important.
Andy, I've got a quick question. You say some of your landscape enterprise networks will be on the go for a while.
Yeah.
Can you maybe give an example how far they've got? Particularly when you're talking about multiple funders.
Yeah.
Because they're all going to have their own agenda.
They are, and I guess probably the easiest one to talk about is the East of England one. So that, again, all of the programmes are landscape-based, so they're focused on the geography, but inevitably for some of those geographies there'll be a bias towards a particular farming approach. So for East of England it's primarily arable. And what we saw, we went in on the first round, a lot of work to do. Again, we recognise the amount of work required to kick off a new programme, but we got a good level of engagement. We would typically anticipate creating a new round of trades circa every 12 months. There isn't a kind of cut and dried, but normally we'd expect maybe every 12 months. The East of England one was so successful within that first round, but we ended up having to pull the second round trade forwards 5 months because the level of interest both from the funder side and from the farmer side. Second round trades were oversubscribed by over 100% from a farmer perspective because of the enthusiasm to engage, the kind of income shift that it drove. In terms of funding pot, that more than doubled. It doubled by about 150% in terms of overall value of the pot. And in terms of funder interest, that extended now. So we've got local authority, we've got 2 big branded FMCG, we've got 3 big arable suppliers, we've got 3 water utility companies in that latest round, and then for the next round that again we've had to pull forwards by another 6 months, we've got probably another 3 big FMCGs in discussions at the moment as well. And across Lens in the UK, we've probably got about 60, probably 70% now of water utilities engaging in the programme because of the value that they can see in terms of driving change through nature-based approaches as opposed to hard civil solutions. So that's the kind of transition we're starting to see play through. In mainland Europe, we were really surprised. We thought it'd be quite challenging getting the programmes off the ground, but actually they've jumped into it very, very quickly. And again, we're seeing rapid scaling on those as well, particularly in Hungary and Poland. So, yeah, different for different locations, different interests, but generally that's the kind of shift that we're seeing, or evolution that we're seeing.
And the farmer businesses that are engaged in that, does it take account of how far they've already gone down the route of trying to take their own business towards net zero? Because that's a big concern for us at the moment. We don't have a coherent policy, so we're almost frightened to make a start because you think, well, once you've done that, nobody's going to cover that cost.
Yeah. And I think that's important. That's why, well, 2 things. A, we're keen for people to engage early so we can help address that issue and move quickly. The other one is we've done quite a lot of work in the UK, particularly both with Scottish Government and with Westminster in terms of exploring how farmers aren't compromised. So we did a lot of work with DEFRA and Treasury, for example, ensuring that when ELMS is, as it's been progressively launched, that each of those tiers still enables the application of lens and lens thinking without compromising the farmer's ability to engage in ELMS specifically. So we're trying to manage that as best we can. Obviously, we're operating within that kind of policy landscape. But again, by working together, we can help kind of frame that and try and minimise any risk for the farmer in terms of early engagement.
Okay, I think we're running out of time there, so I'd just like to thank Andy for his presentation today. I'm sure there's a saying somewhere about beware the softly spoken messenger, but we appreciate coming into the lion's den, as it were, in a way, Andy, to give it. It's a difficult subject, and it's gratifying to hear that a company like Diageo says they need our help to achieve these targets. And I think that's hugely important. So, on behalf of us all, thank you very much indeed.